share a passage of scripture with you today that we don't typically think of as a nativity story, but in reality, when you really ponder it, you discover that it is. I'm talking about the very first chapter of the letter of Hebrews, beginning with verse number 1. Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many various ways by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by a son whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also created the worlds. He, referring to Jesus, he is the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being, and he sustains all things by his powerful word. When he had made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. Make a lot of sense? Well, hopefully it will. I do not hear it. May God add his blessing to this reading from his holy word. Please join me in a moment of prayer. Wonderful God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, we pray, O Lord, our prophet and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, the holidays, or maybe we should say the holy day, is soon upon us, isn't it? We find ourselves now in the third week of this Advent season, a period of waiting, and we are ready to embrace yet another chapter taken from these wonderful gifts: hope, peace, joy, and love. In fact, what I'd like to do with you this morning is speak a little bit about the unexpected ways that God comes into our lives through these marvelous gifts. I mean, after all, our God is a God of surprise, isn't he? Whoever would have figured out that he was going to send a baby into the world to save the world? Makes no sense, does it, from a human point of view? But indeed, from God's point of view, it makes all the sense in the world. He sent his Son into the world to surprise us and to open us to the powerful and profound spiritual realities with which we are surrounded. So, I believe that if God could surprise us long ago in that very special way, he continues to surprise us in very unexpected ways, even today. See it? You know. For example, consider the experience that a woman had. It was a week ago. She was in Manhattan. She was shopping, and she was exhausted. Had been at it all day long. And so she decided she needed a rest. So a delicatessen walked in, found a table that was open, and decided that was for her. Ran up to the counter, got a package of cookies, a cup of coffee, ran back, found that table still empty, and she sat down. Blessed relief. Finally off her feet. Well, she was taking a deep breath and just feeling a little at ease when suddenly a stranger came in and sat down right across from her. Very same table. And it wasn't just any stranger. I mean, she had no idea who it was, obviously. Like I said, it was a stranger. But it was a person that disquieted her to some extent. Because you see, this stranger, the home to a second cookie. Well, now she's moving beyond being just a little bit agitated. Now she's very, very angry. She puts that baby down and she just glares at the man. And suddenly realizes that she just can't stay here anymore. She's got to get out of this place. So she stands up, totally disgusted, picks up her packages and stomps out of the restaurant, hails a taxi, gets in the back seat, and just sits there. And all of a sudden she didn't know what came over her. But she was so upset she started to weep. So she opens her pocketbook to get out a Kleenex. And there, right in the top of the pocketbook, were the cookies. The very cookies she had purchased. And suddenly she realized the cookies she was eating in the delicatessen weren't hers. They belonged to the bum. He was, in fact, sharing a part of himself. He had so little, but he was sharing a part of himself with this stranger. She said she thought about that and has thought about that over and over through the years, every time season comes along yet again. And she realizes that that was the moment for her that Christ was truly born. She said she began to realize and understand for the first time what this whole concept of you can't tell a book by its cover really meant. She began to realize that in each and every one of us, there is that spark of good. It doesn't matter where our lives have taken us, but the truth of the matter is that God places himself in every human being and can surprise us in the most unexpected times in ways that we could never imagine. She called that moment her gift of peace, because she came to a point where she recognized within herself the need to be calm and to be respectful, even in a time of chaos. We talked a little bit about that last week, you may remember. To be calm and respectful and to be mindful of the people all about. Because we indeed do share a common journey, the gift of peace. That's exactly what this story we're talking about today tells us. Listen again. Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. His Son, Jesus, comes into the world that we may find a whole new way of looking at one another, that we may discover what it means to be peacefully centered and respectful of the world around us. And at the center of that world are the people that God sends our way. That was the whole purpose of sending Jesus into the world, so that we might better understand and get our arms around what it means to be people of peace. Which leads us to some of these other gifts that we're going to consider in just a moment. The gift of peace. You remember when Jesus was speaking to that woman at the well? If only, he said to her, if only you knew the wonderful gift that God holds for you. Well, for this woman, it was the gift of peace. But then consider another unexpected moment. Has something to do not so much with the gift of peace, but with the gift of hope. John Ogilvie, do you recognize that name? He was a very well-known preacher. He was the pastor or the chaplain in the United States Senate for many years, and a prolific writer. He shared an experience that he had when he was sitting in a restaurant, much like a Bob Evans. There was a counter at which he was seated. He was having breakfast, and 2 spots away from him, there was a gentleman who was reading the newspaper. And it seemed like every time this guy looked at another article, he would start to complain. He'd have something negative to say. He was grumpy. He just wasn't fun to be around. Well, the young lady who was caring for the counter came by and refilled the man's coffee. And she said, "Are you okay, sir? You seem to be very troubled." And he said, "Troubled?
You bet I'm troubled. Haven't you read the paper? There's no good news in this world. And she said, Sir, you've got to have some hope. Hope, he said. Hope? Are you crazy? Where do you find hope in a world like this? If ever there was an existential question, that was it. Where do you find hope in a world like this? Ogilvy reflected upon that exchange that he witnessed, and he said that it really opened his own thinking. Where do we find hope in a world like this? Well, the truth of the matter is that we don't necessarily find that hope in this world, do we? The season of Advent, which leads us to Christmas, reminds us that our hope is beyond this moment in time. Our hope comes to life through the birth of a child, Ogilvy was saying, and it's through that child that we understand as he grows to be a man, as he gives his life as a sacrifice for all of us, that we have spiritual security now and forever. That is the gift of hope made real by Jesus Christ. And it came to life in a very unexpected way for Ogilvy in that moment, and probably for some of the others who were sitting around witnessing that man and his sour attitude. Where do you find hope in a world like this? You find hope in a world like this in a child named Jesus. Again, as the author of Hebrews is writing, he makes this statement. He said, he sustains all things by his powerful word. That is a word of hope. When you're broken, when you lose significant people in your lives, and that happens to all of us, when we struggle with illness, when we have broken families, whatever the challenge is, or take it beyond the personal, take it to the world in which we're living. I mean, think about what's happening in our political world, the division, how frightening all of this is that's happening. Where do we find our hope? We find our hope in a little babe in Bethlehem, Jesus the Christ, who's going to come and show us a better way. We all need hope in this world of ours, don't we? And Jesus surprises us and shows us exactly how to find it. Well, that brings us to the third possibility or gift of the season, and that's joy. Wonderful joy. I have an experience that I'd like to share with you that issued itself in an unexpected way to the gift of joy. This happened many years ago, back in the 90s actually. I don't remember exactly which 90 it was, but it was in the 90s. I was having my car repaired, and I was at the Honda dealership. It was called Performance Honda back then. I have no clue if it even still exists, but anyway, that's where I was. And I was sitting in the waiting room, and there were a couple of other women that were in the waiting room as well. And in walked two young people. And they captured our attention immediately, probably because they were just a little different than we were. They were dressed differently. They looked differently. They had a lot of jewelry in some unusual places. And their hair, well, the beautiful accents of orange and purple and green just set off the outfit, you know. And this was long before that became a popular fad as it is today. So here they were. And they sat down, and they were kind of oblivious to everything that was happening around them. And I couldn't help but notice, as did the other two women that were in here, that people were starting to walk by the door of the waiting room. And they'd kind of walk by, and they'd pause for a moment, and they'd look in. And you could see this smile on their face, and then they'd go on. And before you know it, it was like there was a parade. So obviously the word was spreading around this dealership. And people were coming by and looking in the room, and they were finding some amusement. You'll notice we figured that they weren't looking at us. Maybe they were. Who knows? But at any rate, we couldn't help but notice what was going on. But like I said, these kids were oblivious to everything that was happening. Well, I sat and they were talking to each other. It turns out that they were students at the University of Cincinnati. And she was a math student, or a math major, and struggling with a course that she was taking. She had her work there. The plan was to work on their work while they were waiting for the car. And then he was an English major in literature. And I couldn't help but overhear what they were saying. In fact, he was rather disgusted. He couldn't believe his assignment given by his literature professor, remember, it's the Christmas season, his assignment was to read the Gospel of John. You think he enjoyed that assignment? He started talking about this ridiculous professor who was asking him to do this incredibly stupid thing. I mean, why should he have to read the Gospel of John? He hated when people tried to shove their faith down his throat, and he wanted nothing to do with it. He was disgusted, and he went on, and he's describing this experience and this professor using some rather colorful language that I won't use. But then he says, listen to this. And he opens up the Bible that he had with him, because he had to read this assignment. And he said to his friend, listen to this. And then in an exaggerated and kind of a disgusted way, he started to repeat the first verse of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Well, I'm sitting there, taking all of this in, and I've been quiet to this point, trying to respect his ability. He doesn't have to, it's up to him if he wants to believe or not believe. That's his choice to make. But somehow in that moment, he just crossed a line. And then he said to his friend, you know, this is just so stupid. This makes absolutely no sense. That was it. I said, you know, sometimes stupid isn't related to the things that we're reading. Sometimes stupid is the attitude we bring to something we're reading that we don't understand. You know what? I had his attention. He just looked at me, and I went on and I said, you know, I'm concerned because this really does make sense, but you just don't understand it. And I said, would you like for me to help you with that? And he looked at me and he said, hey, dude, this ain't none of your business. And I said, that's where you're wrong. It is my business. I'd be glad to help you. He looked at me like I was from outer space. So I took that as yes. And I started to explain to him, now, you need to understand, I said, that this doesn't necessarily make sense unless you get the background. You see, John was writing to a Greek culture. People understood the Greek language. And the word that's translated here as word is literally logos. And that word to the Greeks meant the mind of God or the wisdom of God. So you see, what he's really saying in those few words is that Jesus, who was part of the mind of God and the wisdom of God, Jesus was present with God at the very beginning of time. In the beginning there was Jesus, and Jesus was with God, and Jesus was God. That's exactly what John is saying. It doesn't come clear to us, does it? But it was very clear to the Greeks a long time ago. That's what that means. And I looked at him, and he looked at me, and he said, yeah, dude, that's cool. That's cool. And you know, for the next 15 or 20 minutes, we turned that little room into a theological conversation. It was an unexpected gift that came to me. At first, there was all this tension that was there. But suddenly that melted away as we had this opportunity to simply joyfully enjoy some time together. Hopefully, they were helped a little bit along the way. I wish I could say that in the moment they accepted Jesus, but no, that didn't happen. I told them, you don't have to believe this. This is your call to make, but you have to understand it. because you can't consider yourself educated if you don't understand it. You're free to choose to believe or walk away. That's up to you. I invited them to church. They never came. I have no clue whatever happened to those two young people, but I do know this. A seed was planted that afternoon. And in the process of that conversation, who knows where it might lead. This I can tell you. It filled my heart with joy. It was just a great moment. Well, they left. And then when they left, these two women came over, and I thought, oh no, what now? And they just came over to say thank you. They said, we were upset by what was going on. We didn't understand it either, and you had the courage of your convictions. You stood up and you said something, and you helped them to understand, and we appreciate that so very much. And the other woman said, I've heard that story so many times over the years, but I never understood what it meant either. Thank you. And they both gave me a hug. It was another unexpected moment of joy. That's what the writer of Hebrews is talking about. He is the reflection, the writer says, of God's glory. Now, what is that glory? We'll go back, if you will, and take a look in the 2nd chapter of Luke and listen to what it says. In that region there were shepherds living in the fields, keeping watch over their flocks by night. And then an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, do not be afraid, for see, I am bringing you good news of great joy for all the people. The glory of the Lord shone round them. And what was that glory? It was great joy for all the people. When the writer is talking about that glory in Hebrews, he's referencing this child, Jesus. Remember, we said this is in a theological interpretation of what the Nativity was all about. He's telling us that this child is bringing joy into the world. Isn't that a beautiful concept? Joy. The third gift of the season. Well, time's right. By the way, Larry told me I had 4 hours today. But I think time is running along a little bit, so let me come to the end. We haven't considered yet the gift of love, have we? And I've got to tell you about Willie. Willie is a little boy, and Willie is a special needs student. He's very, very, very slow, doesn't understand a lot. But he was in school, and it was Christmas time, and it was time for the annual pageant. And Willie wanted to be part of the pageant. But his teacher was really, really concerned. She knew that he probably wouldn't be able to remember the lines, that he might get mixed up and not know where he was supposed to be. But he just begged her because he wanted to be in the pageant. And so she said yes. And she decided she would make Willie the innkeeper. It would be the simplest thing that he could do. All he'd have to say was, no room in the inn. And so they practiced, and sometimes he got it right, and sometimes he didn't get it right. But the big night finally came. Curtain was across the front of you know how you do, the curtain was across the front of the classroom. The kids were all excited. There was just all this joy was in the air. And Willie was beside himself. He just couldn't wait. This was his moment. And so the pageant started. And at the appropriate time, Joseph came along and knocked on the door. And Willie opens the door. And Joseph says, sir, we need a place to stay. And Willie looks at him and he says, no room in the inn. Teacher was relieved. But Joseph says, but sir, you have to let us in. We've been traveling and we need a place to rest. And Willie said for the second time, no room in the inn. With a little more gusto, And Joseph did his part, and he said for the third time, but sir, please, you have to understand. You see my wife, she's going to have a baby. She's exhausted. We've been on the road. And Willie's supposed to say, no room in the inn, and slam the door. But Willie is just looking at Joseph and Mary. And he doesn't say anything. And his teacher thought, oh no, he's forgotten. So she started to move up into a point where she could kind of cue him. But when she got close, she noticed that Willie had tears rolling down his cheeks. And Willie looked at Joseph and Mary, and he said, come on in. You can have my room. I dare say, friends, that that's what this season is all about. It's about the love of God that's extended to every single one of us. The love of God which opens his arms and he says, come on in. You can have my room. There's a space for you. This love of God is what leads to the peace and to the joy and to the hope of Christmas. This love of God is a gift for every single one of us. God loved the world so much that he gave his only begotten Son. That's the gift. Unexpected, to be sure, 2,000 years ago. But now, with all of our history and experience, we know that the Lord Jesus indeed is alive, is coming to us every day, and he'll be here yet again come Christmas Day. Come on in. You can have my room. Amen.